Hi, I'm Neal Vorus. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, and I'm here for the latest installment of Quarterly Conversations. These are our video interviews with authors to the journal. In every issue, we choose one article that stands out to offer for free download through free access, and one of us interviews the author of that article. And it's my great pleasure today that I get to be the one to interview Joe Aguayo. So welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Neal. Glad to be here.
And let me give you a proper introduction. Um, there's a lot to say here. Joseph Aguayo is a training and supervising analyst at the Psychoanalytic Center of California and a guest member of the British Psychoanalytical Society. He holds PhDs in both clinical psychology and European history from UCLA. And in addition to his 4 books on Bion's clinical work, he also directs the Regional Bion Symposium, a consortium of North American analysts who attend year-round online meetings on Bion, Winnicott, Klein, and Post-Bionians. And in addition, Joe has written a lot of articles, just probably over the past 20 years, on the history of British psychoanalysis, and in particular, the history of Bion's contribution to psychoanalysis. And I first got to know Joe's work when he came to New York several times to talk about Bion at IPTAR. So I'm very pleased to have Joe here, and in a way, we're continuing the conversation we had at lunch last month in San Francisco. So I'm very eager to get back into that. But let me first say a couple things about the paper and why we thought this was the one to choose for this issue. Joe's paper is entitled W.R. Bion's Case of the Imaginary Twin, an Implicit Method of Clinical Inquiry. And there's several things that distinguish this paper. One is that it goes back to Bion's membership paper from 1950. Which, as Joe points out in the paper, most of us don't. I think I read that once a long time ago. Most of us, we go to attacks on linking or notes on memory and desire or Bion's books, and this is in some way a underappreciated paper. And Joe makes a strong case for that because he's able to distill in the paper all the essential elements of Bion's mature clinical technique, which is an important and valuable resource in its own right to really see that distilled so clearly. But it's also so interesting that it was there at the start, even though Bion's theory went through so many changes. His technique was there at the beginning, or in his first paper as a qualified psychoanalyst, at least. And the other, to me, very interesting thing about this paper is that Joe makes the case that it was disguised in some way intentionally. The Bion camouflaged his innovation here in this paper. And it's only now that we can kind of see through some of the camouflage, and Joe unpacks the historical and political dimensions to that. So it's very interesting, and I hope we can get into all of this today. But maybe to get the ball rolling, Joe, could you talk a little bit about why you decided to go back to this early paper of Bion's to begin with?
Gosh, I'd have to go back to my training. I have a training at the Psychoanalytic Center of California, which modeled itself after the British Psychoanalytic Society. So you get a year of infant observation and Freud, a second year of Klein, and then the third year we would get Bion. And we had some people that had been analyzed and supervised by Bion, and I had had a Kleinian analysis during my training, and I actually found my first encounters with Bion quite puzzling and quite estranging, actually. I had an instructor, and we read Second Thoughts, and this is where I first encountered the twin paper, and I was just, like everybody else, just baffled and mystified by this paper. And when I attempted to make my queries known to the instructor, he got very upset and said that this paper should be obvious to you, and it wasn't obvious to me. And so I just kind of scratched my head and walked away and went back to Klein, which I found much more to my taste at the time. But I had the good fortune of also having Jim Grotstein, a premier Bion scholar, as my supervisor. And he said, well, just try and stick with it because eventually you'll find that it'll make sense. But along the way, we would have people that would come and give talks on Bion and Beckett, for instance. And I mean, really notable analysts went down the rabbit hole of saying, oh, there was a secret symmetry between Bion and Beckett, and you can see it in the twin. And the paper just mystified me even more because I couldn't see the connection. And I didn't realize at the time, but there wasn't really much evidence for the connection between Bion and Beckett. And then, of course, Beckett's letters got released in 2013, and he writes a little bit about his psychotherapy with Bion, but he doesn't make very much of it. And actually, Bion was asked in Los Angeles about his relationship with Beckett, and in one lecture, he said, well, I don't really think I hurt him, but I don't think I helped him very much.
Huh.
So you're left with this feeling that there was this underwhelming experience that both of them had because they were both at the beginning of their career. Bion was very depressed, very unhappy at the Tavistock. Beckett really hadn't written much to get more than local attention. And so, again, another head scratching situation where the literature about the twin doesn't make any sense. And then along the way, I had the good fortune of getting connected to really premier analysts and historians at the British Society, primarily Bob Hinshelwood, who has a long-term interest in both Klein and Bion, and also one of the members of our team who sadly passed away a few years ago, wonderful independent analyst named Sarah Derman. So I would have weekly consultations with her, and then the other weeks I would have historical conversations with Bob Hinshelwood, which we've been carrying on for the last 25 years. And I thought, surely there must be some way of integrating my love of clinical psychoanalysis with history. And so when we released our book in 2014 on Bion in Los Angeles, I saw an opportunity to now start looking directly at his clinical examples and saying, why don't we turn this big Bion cottage industry on its head, and rather than do all these theory elaborations and then get down to the clinical work, why don't we do it the other way around and come at the clinical work and work up? And so I came back to the twin. And
Huh.
then all of a sudden, it started to make much more sense to me. And I realized that one of the reasons why I concluded it was an underappreciated text was because there's so much disguise, the patient's disguise, Bion's disguise, and then the disguise of the epistemology, which he later over superimposes on the paper so that it makes even less sense. So
Right.
there's a lot of stuff to unpack about the paper, and
Right.
that's really what I tried to do in this current submission.
Yeah. You made the point because he didn't publish it until 67 in Second Thoughts, so it remained unpublished. And then you make the point that it's the longest commentary of all the papers that are in Second Thoughts. He has the most to add to the imaginary twin. So it obviously stayed in his mind as an important
Hmm.
paper. Um,
Yes.
maybe you could talk a little bit about the camouflage, because that's one of the most intriguing parts of your paper, is the layers of disguise. And what was going on? Why would Bion feel the need to keep his ideas hidden at that time?
Yeah. That's the stuff of a kind of an Agatha Christie mystery because I think that there are many layers of camouflage and disguise. One is just a very practical one. He's faced with trying to become a member of the British Society in 1950, and this is just after the controversial discussions have ended. And it was, by anybody's account, a very traumatic atmosphere. I mean, Britain, London had been bombed. I mean, these people are trying to get their lives back together. There's tremendous austerity. As a matter of fact, if you look at the pages of the International Journal during this time, all the papers are sort of crowded together. They don't have separate pages because they were trying to conserve paper. And so, in this very austere atmosphere, Bion is trying to come forward to be elected as a member. But I think one of the important camouflages was that he wanted to make sure he got elected, particularly by the group that had the most animus towards the Klein group, which was the Freud group under Anna Freud. So I think, among other things, part of the camouflage is he doesn't give any references at the end of the paper, which is pretty mystifying in and of itself, because that's a centuries old, time-honored technique of, you acknowledge your intellectual debts. These are the people that influenced me. But I think that essentially in that austere, very, very paranoid atmosphere would have made Bion a target. So I think he just said, well, let's just eliminate the references so people will have to guess who influenced me. And the
It's
other bit
interesting.
of camouflage,
He does cite Klein
yeah,
in the text,
intermittently in the
but he
text.
doesn't put a reference at the
Right,
end. Yeah.
right. That's a really good point because if you contrast that with a much easier time in the 30s when Winnicott does his membership paper in 1935 on the manic defense, in the very first line, he is proud to announce his association with the work on manic defenses of Melanie Klein, and he cites it throughout the paper. And so again, you realize that Klein is a reference to the Bion twin paper, but it's kind of in the middle of the paper, kind of hidden.
Yeah.
The other bit of camouflage that's so significant, much harder to get to, is he starts the paper out with a 2 or 3 page recitation of the twins' early history, a very traumatic history, death of a sibling, breakdown when he's 13, the death of his mother when he's 17. I mean, the stuff of pure trauma. And then, of course, he never mentions it again in the rest of the paper. So again, you're left with this kind of head scratching experience of like, well, then why did he put it in? And I think if you look at it under the circumstances of the British society, it have had the appearance of looking like a kind of a traditional early history that you would find in a Freudian case study. So he's saying, well, here's my homage to Freud. I'll trot out the early history. And so those people will be satisfied, presumably, by seeing that I can take early history into account. But then, of course, the conceit is he never uses it that we can see in the actual case study itself.
Right. There is, I was wondering about that because one piece of the traumatic history is that he and a sister that was 18 months older were both very sick, and she died early on, and he survived this illness that they both had.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was an other. Now, she wasn't a twin, but you could easily imagine someone making a kind of reconstruction, the
Sure.
fantasy of the twin to the sister who was died, um, but he doesn't do that in the paper.
Right. I think again, it reminds me of what Dostoevsky said, I think in The Idiot, that they're the secrets that I keep from other people, but then they pale in comparison to the secrets that I keep from myself. I think that much as that early history of the twin is very traumatic, so was Bion's history. And I think at this point in his career, he didn't know how to factor in his own traumatic history, being shipped out from India at the age of 8, losing his family, never seeing India again, and then all the comrades that he lost in the First World War, the death of his wife in childbirth in 1945. I just think he didn't have a way of factoring it in. So he said, it's going to be kind of a scotoma to me, as it was for the twin in the case study. So he did play it in. Uh,
Right, and that's, I guess, a clue to his technique. Like, and this is a point that you make, that to the end, he didn't do any, not only did he not do reconstruction in the Freudian mode, but he also didn't link the fantasy experience in the present with the fantasy experience in the past, as the
right.
Kleinians did.
Right. And I think Klein was very clear about that point. You're exactly right. In her 1952 paper on transference, the total situation takes into account. I mean, if you think about the child analytic situation, you start with the child playing in real time, but you're always interested in getting back to the remembered past of the child so that you can reconstruct usually the early maternal history and then make transference interpretations that are displaced from past to present. Bion came along, was trained in that tradition, and then just simply dropped the early bit so that you don't see him linking the early to the later. So whereas somebody might have well said, well, as you were just pointing out, the sister died in childhood and he survived. He could have had survivor's guilt, but you don't see any trace of that in the text.
No. One other disguise that hit me as very thin was his claim that the patient was a teacher.
Hmm.
And all through that text, it's clear the patient's a physician. There's
Absolutely.
there's no other way to read what he's writing, and so that's this very thin veneer. Um, and I suppose that, I mean, we have different standards today about confidentiality,
Hmm.
but it's just at the outset, and the paper is filled with um, references to referring patients, and he calls them students, but they're for medical care.
Right,
Um,
right.
uh, One other thing that just struck me as is really notable is this was a patient who had been in a therapy before for many years, and the therapist seems to have given up and said, next step is a lobotomy.
Right.
So, so the patient on his way to a lobotomy ends up with Bion, and Bion, I think, does remarkable work. In my reading of it, just changes his life with his
Hmm.
approach.
Hmm.
And is in his commentary, he's a lot of this, what he writes about it later is his sort of um, calling into question anybody's ability to recount accurately anything that happens in any treatment.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
by all appearances, this was a very successful treatment.
Right. I think there's a couple of really important points that you're alluding to there. Reminds me that lamentably before he passed away, Chris Mawson, who was the editor of the Complete Works, actually came to the first annual meeting of our Regional Bion Symposium back in 2016, and I had a conversation with him about it, like, gosh, given that Bion was so threadbare and needed any publicity he could get for his work in 1950, why didn't he publish The Twin Case? It was his graduation paper. And Chris's surmise was, he said, well, he was a physician, and so probably for reasons of confidentiality, he didn't want to run the risk of having any identity exposed. And then he could do that later on in 1967. So it's one of the reasons why he thinks that, and I agree that this clearly is a physician. He's not a school teacher. It is a very thin disguise. And so you see this paper later on, but at the same time, what's also fascinating about it is because in our long book project, which incidentally just got reviewed this month in the current issue of the IJP, we were trying to get at, since Bion was not interested in setting out a technique. At one point in a paper in 1955, he says, it'd be wonderful if I could set out my technique, but it would be misleading. So it's the kind of thing that he didn't give a lot of thought to explicitly. And certainly outside of the paper on Notes on Memory and Desire, he didn't write about technique. So then it leaves it to us later on, all these decades later, to try and see, well, is there some way we can put together his technique by looking at as many clinical examples as we can? And of course, the big surprise in reading from that perspective, the twin paper, is that all the essentials of what I would call Bion's practice as an idiosyncratic Kleinian, it's all there in the 1950 paper,
Huh.
which is what I think makes it so underappreciated.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and I want to get you to elaborate that. But along the lines of camouflage, he also seems to underplay that there's anything distinctive about what he was doing. And I don't know
Hmm.
if that was deliberate, but I think you were making that point as well, that and you've made it in other papers, that Bion had a way of staying in the fold by downplaying any difference between what he did and what Kleinians did, whereas
Hmm.
Winnicott played a different game and got cast out.
Right. I think this is probably, I think the result of certainly one of the idiosyncratic features of Bion's makeup was having all this group experience, where he was just first introduced to psychotherapy through taking a group. And this is the beginning of group psychotherapy. And he doesn't know what he's doing in the beginning, But I think borrowing from his military training, he said, in essence, I can always count on my sense of how I directly experience or observe what's going on in the group and how they impact me, so that he winds up saying things like in 1948, I listen to my countertransference before I even think about what the group's transference is to me. And I think that's for a very practical reason, because in the war, he said, when you meet somebody on the battlefield, you've got to form a pretty instantaneous assessment of, can I rely on this person in combat? Or is this person going to be the person that's going to run the other way? So I think he was used to the idea of making quick assessments. And I think he took that into his analytic work. And I think one of the assessments that he made was he watched his own highly esteemed supervisor, Paula Hyman, just after the twin paper was released, get into this acrimonious fight with Klein because she wanted Klein to recognize her work on the countertransference. And of course, Klein didn't want her to give the paper.
Right.
The same thing with Winnicott. He wanted recognition for the transitional objects paper, but of course he was starting to take issue with the paranoid schizoid position, so that wasn't acceptable. So the next thing you know, you have these loud, acrimonious public fights that these really esteemed analysts get involved with. I think Bion was watching all that and said, that's not going to be me. And so I think he stayed out of the way of that.
Right.
But
He
I think
learned
it
to
was,
keep his head down.
yeah, yeah. He was kind of like the Trojan horse, I think, in the Klein group. He just kept his head down and kept his differences to himself, and they were so stealthily expressed that I don't think anybody really noticed
What's
because all the other
interesting,
people were
yeah,
making so much more noise. Yeah, go ahead.
you cite a letter from Winnicott in 1951 in reference to the twin paper, and Winnicott says it's interesting. He really likes the paper, and he says
Hmm.
something to the effect of, "I don't really, I know it's important, but it'll take us a while to figure out what you mean by all this." And
Hmm.
so you get the sense, or I did from that letter, that he recognized probably a kinship, but also that there was something indecipherable in Bion's work or his writing, and I guess that's what makes a lot of us struggle with Bion for many years to try to understand him. But
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
Winnicott is, in contrast, is is incredibly clear in his. I mean, he's deceptively clear in contrast to Bion. But Winnicott's difference from Klein stands out so markedly. And
Hmm.
Bion's, you got to scratch your head and read it again, and so it's sort of stays under the radar. And you made a reference in the paper to the way Bion knew about camouflage, especially on tanks.
Hmm.
Like that was maybe part of his war experience that he carried
Right.
with him.
And I think again, camouflage is an invention of the First World War because now you have, with tank guns, with artillery, uh, snipers, you have the possibility of being able to kill people at distances. And so the whole issue of camouflage becomes terribly important if you're going to stay out of harm's way. So it's something that's in his blood. I mean, I think he understood about how to survive under enemy fire in those kind of situations. Well, now you have the civilian version of that warfare in the post-controversial discussions where these groups are so acrimonious that people were often shocked at the way in which people carried on. I mean, the famous story, of course, told by Winnicott that London is actually being bombed in 1944, and it's Winnicott who has to stand up on a chair and say, I think we need to repair to the underground because they wanted to go on having the Freud-Klein debate and fighting rather than realizing that they could be killed momentarily. So it
Yeah.
was life and death struggle.
Leave it to Winnicott to notice the environment, right?
Hmm.
That's
That's
that's funny.
that's very good.
But it's before Winnicott. That was before he departed from Klein. At that point, he was one of her chief lieutenants during the controversies. Um,
Absolutely.
Maybe you could unpack the what I think was one of the real innovations of this paper, in your research group you referred to, that you had done all this work to distill the implicit method of clinical inquiry, which I
Hmm.
just find incredibly valuable to have that all in one place, so clearly written. So maybe you could say some things about that.
Right. Well, it's only clear in the aftermath, but it took us discussions that went on for years because we would meet every other week. This is Bob Hensherwood, Sarah Derman, yeah, originally Barney Malin, a colleague of mine in Los Angeles, but he dropped out of the project. And then we invited Nicola Abel Hirsch into the group. So the four of us um, would carry this tension between Bob and I, on the one side, being very interested in the history of the British Society as a background context, and of course, Nicola and Sarah being, dyed-in-the-wool analytic practitioners that were very interested in getting the analytic meaning of the text. And so it was really trying to wed those two methodologies that led to a paper like this. And along the way, we had to come to some sort of conclusion about, okay, do we see any recurrent patterns in the way Bion analyzes? And also now in the last 10 years, because there's been just a number, 4 or 5 books on Bion supervisions, we now have a lot more clinical material to work with. So prior to 2014, I think you see that most Bion studies are very, very top heavy in theory and then derive the practice from it. But now, because we have all these clinical examples, we thought, well, let's give a go at trying to get at what we call the implicit method of clinical inquiry. Implicit because he never formulated outside of the notes on memory and desire. And then we had to make our best guesses about, okay, how does he go about the actual enterprise of doing an analytic session, or how does he do a supervision?
Huh. So what are the elements? I know you have five of them
Right.
in the paper.
Just in summary form, I mean, first, I think is the use of the common senses. You use your eyes, your ears, and sometimes your nose to get a sense of the patient. And I think that, if you look at his group work, I mean, he's just absolutely the quintessential observer of group processes. So he can describe in a very observational way what it is he's seeing. But then I think as he gets into more of the psychoanalytic period around the time of the twin, the issue of making observations has to go through a necessary point of transition into the realm of the psyche, into the realm of the invisible, where you then say, well, based on what I'm seeing with my senses, how do I transfer that into something invisible, psychological, that can be kind of an organizing template so that I can make sense and make an intervention? So the classic thing in his group work, for instance, was people are milling around and somebody finally says, well, what are we supposed to do? After all, this is Dr. Bion's psychotherapy group. So what would you like us to do? And he's quiet, gives them a blast of analytic silence, and eventually says, you actually have a wish for me to tell you what to do, to lead you, but actually it's work you have to do yourselves. So in essence, you have to roll up your sleeves and understand that in essence, you're starting to put me into a position of being the leader. So this is where it gets part of that idea of the dependency group basic assumption. But again, it's using his good observational skills to transit into the realm of the psyche. And I think, based on his experience with John Rickman, his first analyst, he then took some of those ideas and then imported them, I think, into his analytic work. So, for instance, one of the big things that Rickman talked about in the group experience was being role responsive. The group attempts to recruit the analyst in or the facilitator into a role, the dependency group leader, the pairing leader, the fight flight leader. And so if it's good in those kind of group situations, I think Bion figured it would be good in the analytic situation. So again, what he then realizes when he treats the twin is, oh, I've been unconsciously recruited into the position of being kind of this semi-paralyzed, befuddled anesthetized listener, and it just doesn't feel like anything is happening in this analysis. And because he put a lot of stock in his subjective experience, he then eventually was able to offer that to the patient by saying, you know, when you tell me about these things that happen in your everyday life in your village, are those real events or are they imaginary? And it was like the question the twin had been waiting for all his life. And he said,
Yeah.
oh, they're imaginary. And then he realized he had gone down a rabbit hole with the patient and had been completely taken in by this disguise that this sort of false self-presentation presented to him.
Right. So he starts with his senses, and then
Right.
he adds listening to his countertransference and paying
Mm-hmm.
attention to the roles that he gets
That he's
assigned.
recruited into. Yeah.
Right.
He makes another very famous statement about the effects of projective identification, which is so crucial to the whole idea of role recruitment. I think in 1955, when he says, how did I, as the analyst, wind up becoming a player on your interior landscape? So if you translate that into the twins' experience, how was it that unwittingly Bion allowed himself to be recruited into being this kind of paralyzed, anesthetized, befuddled listener? Because at the base of it, of course, the patient was an unreliable narrator. He himself was completely taken in by his own disguise. It wasn't anything he was consciously aware of. So then this is where you get to the sort of core idea of the paper that when Bion entitles it the imaginary twin, that was his realization. Ah, I had been unconsciously recruited to be the imaginary twin of this person who's living behind this defensive enclave and is most afraid of having any kind of a direct emotional contact with another human being.
Right. Yeah, it's clear, especially after reading your paper and then going back to the twin paper, that's the central pivot when Bion says, "Wait, are these people real or imaginary?" And just as you
Mm-hmm.
said, he comes right out with it,
Mm-hmm.
which is astonishing in a way because you also can see how invested the patient was initially in deadening everything. And it
Mm-hmm.
was like, Bion could barely keep his eyes open, I think.
Right.
It was
Right.
so deadly until he picks that up. And at that point, the patient then has this really crucial dream, and
Mm-hmm.
Bion is able to work with that. And after that, there's a shift, and they're working. The patient is clearly making use of Bion in a different way after that,
Mm-hmm.
and he can accept to some degree Bion's otherness. I think after that
Mm-hmm.
interpretation, where before that point he's recruited to be the imaginary twin, where he's not actually other than the patient.
Right. And so he's a person of no emotional consequence as a
Right.
result of that. Yeah.
Right.
But with that crucial intervention that he made, then he was a person of emotional consequence. And I think, as you're rightly saying, his otherness was finally recognized because in his analysis of the dream of the two drivers, uh, where the patient depicts it as if he caught up with Bion and calibrated to him, it was actually a role reversal because actually it was Bion who calibrated to the patient and said,
Right.
"Oh, you're hiding in plain sight," which then led to all this paranoia and claustrophobia and suffocation fears that the patient had because he had finally been contacted, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
was very frightening and very terrifying.
I think one of the other points of the implicit clinical method that you emphasize is Bion's distinction between he paid attention to, is there some kind of destructive projective identification that's disabling our being able to have an analysis at all? Or
Mm-hmm.
is there the type that can be worked with interpretively?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that pivotal intervention shifted from one type to the other.
Right.
Because after
Right.
that, there's all kinds of projections and splitting and so forth. But Bion
Absolutely
can
right.
interpret it, and the patient benefits from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think this makes another really good point because I think that part of returning these important analytic figures to their proper context is that you can begin to appreciate that, Bion had some really wonderful mentors. Because there's a kind of Bion scholarship that sort of portrays Bion as a sort of isolated genius plant, like, oh, you could have put him in London or Los Angeles, Buenos Aires, and he would just sprout these genius ideas. But I think very much to your point, he's carrying the twin. We now know he carried him with Paula Hyman. Just as she's working out her most famous, and I think probably one of the most famous papers on countertransference, the 1950 paper, in which she starts to emphasize the value of unconscious to unconscious communication.
Yeah.
And so what I think they were able to distill was, oh my God, you've been unconsciously recruited into this position that the patient is himself in. And so you're both in this kind of imaginary twinship state. And that is the thing that we need to start to understand. And that's what really brought the analysis to life. So I would really want to emphasize, along with, of course, Melanie Klein and John Rickman, there was the third of the trio of important mentors that Bion had in Paula Hyman that I think made these kind of realizations possible.
Yeah.
And he says that in his letters. He says that Paula Hyman was the best one of the Klein group at that time.
One thing that occurred to me was there's Hyman's countertransference ideas, but also he's in analysis with Klein at that time, and she's in the middle of working out projective identification.
Mm-hmm.
Right, she, I think 2 years later,
Mm-hmm.
publishes her um, addendum or her update of notes on some schizoid mechanisms, and there it is. So he's catches both of those ideas. Now, he doesn't use the term projective identification
Mm-mm.
in the
Mm-mm.
paper because it's before the point that Klein publishes it in 52.
Right.
But
Right.
he's clearly digesting all of this at that point.
Absolutely right. I think that, another mystery is that the actual membership paper itself has disappeared from the archives years ago. So nobody knows where this paper is. So it has brought up this other important question like, well, how do we know that the 1967 paper that appears in Second Thoughts is actually the original 1950 membership paper? But I think very much to the point that you're alluding to, because the terms projection and introjection appear in the text of the twin paper, he never once uses the term projective identification because, as you're rightly pointing out, Klein is still working that definition out. That doesn't become the mature definition until 1952.
Yeah,
Uh, so I think that is the original paper that we're
yeah,
seeing in Second Thoughts.
right. He saves his updating for all the extensive notes at the end in that
Mm-hmm.
book.
And of
Um,
course, that's also confusing too, because then he casts it in terms of the epistemology. And if you haven't read his epistemology in the 60s, those notes aren't going to make any sense either, because when he says all case reports are distortions, well, that is our chief way of reporting our results to our colleagues and keeping track of patients. So how can it be rife with distortions? And so you have to understand the epistemology to understand that what he's actually trying to say is that we can never represent all of reality. We make selections. The patient makes selections of their lives that they're going to portray to you. You make selections from what you hear. And so you're just going to get a narrow strip of experience. And he says the most we have are some phenomenological representations, but we can never get at the complete truth.
yeah. You know, one thing I thought a lot about after reading your paper um, and especially the section where you go through what his technique consisted of. You made a statement that it's so pithy. It's really memorable. You said, you know, Klein said that transference is the total situation, but Bion's view is that the present moment is the total situation. And
Mm-hmm.
that kind of captures a lot of it. That's in one statement.
Mm-hmm.
But it made me
Mm-hmm.
think about, of course, Betty Joseph famously really elaborated on that idea of Klein's. And I know that the modern, the British Kleinians were influenced by Bion.
Hmm.
but only to a point.
Right.
Like and I think it's hard to tell sometimes because Bion never formulated his technique where the difference is.
Hmm.
And of course, there's a lot of individual variation. But is there something you could say about that? Like where does the difference lie these days
Hmm.
between your average London Kleinian and where Bion was with technique?
Right. I've written a paper. It was in the IJP in 2011, I think, on Betty Joseph's technique. And when I did a systematic review of all her papers, because she made a very famous statement once. She said, I've only written one paper in my entire career, and that is a paper on technique over and over and over again. But since she was a classmate of Bion's after the war, and there are some stories that said that he actually asked her to marry him, gave her the weekend to think about it, and she dithered, and he wound up moving on and then wound up marrying Francesca, which is never something I've ever found any actual archival evidence for. But the long story short with Betty Joseph is I think she was most impressed with Bion's psychosis papers and his group work and his group sensibility. So I think that what she derives meaning from is what's called the early Bion. If you use Tom Ogden's distinction, he says Bion before 1962 and after 1962. That's the watershed moment for Ogden. But Betty Joseph is a pre-1962 Bionian, um, looking at attacks on linking, destructiveness, microprocessing the patient's reactions, listening to the way your interpretations are being listened to, and then gathering this group as she had for, oh gosh, over 50 years, her workshop group, where these Kleinian analysts would come and then present their cases to her. And a lot of times, if you listen to her interventions that she writes about in those situations, she's listening to the group. Like there's one
Wow.
famous example I can think of where this patient was presented, and every time the analyst tried to understand the patient's early history, he would wind up sort of being mystified. So he brought it to the group, and then everybody in the group made their guesses about what they thought the meaning of some of the early material was, and they were all mystified. And then from that, Betty Joseph concluded, we're listening to someone who is self-mystified by the way they talk about their past. That's the selected fact. So I think in a very, very deft way, I think she melded Bion's group work and the psychosis work to come up with this tracking technique where patient speaks, you make an interpretation, then you listen to the way in which the patient listens to the interpretation. All very well and good. Then you have this whole host of other people, the intersubjectivity people, Ogden, Farrow, Chiva-Terese, Grotstein, who acknowledge that earlier work, but are much more interested in the Bion of the epistemology period, primarily the model of container contained.
Hmm.
And I think effectively speaking, moved the field in the direction of, yes, the pathology is still there, but now are getting more interested in meaning making. And so Bion lends himself to very creative ways of looking at which ideas can be mated to create new templates of meaning. So I think that's some of the differences between the two groups.
Yeah. Of course, you're going to have a chance to say more about that in our October special issue that Rodrigo Barahona is editing on Beyond Around the World. And so that's just a little teaser for what's to come.
Yes, well, I think there's a lot to be said for the California Bion, and I'm really particularly interested in that issue that the quarterly is going to be addressing because, for the longest time, it used to be that we would have these conferences and we would wait for the Kleinian luminaries to come to the United States. And a friend of mine who was an independent said, you were like cargo cult Kleinians. You were waiting for the newest innovations to come from London so that you could finally feed off the pure milk of Kleinian analysis. And what we've discovered in the last 5 or 6 years in our regional study group is that we have plenty of homegrown talent here in the United States that read these same texts differently. And Ogden and Grotstein are two exemplary. I think they're great examples of people who have made British object relations something also distinctly American, which also deserves to be heard.
That's great. Looking forward to reading your paper.
Mhm.
Before we wrap up, one other thing should be mentioned about this paper, which is that this is a version of a paper you presented at the unveiling of the bust of Bion at the
Mhm.
Institute of Psychoanalysis in London, and it took place, I think, on the 75th anniversary of
Of the
the
of the
imaginary twin.
mhm.
So could you say a little bit about that experience and also like how you end up choosing this paper for that event, if that
Well,
was
it
something that you
was
thought about?
I think it was the other way around. They wanted to honor the 75th anniversary of the twin paper in 2025. And it was at that point that they asked me if I would consider doing this, because an earlier version of this paper appears in the book, but I then completely reworked it and put in all the sections on Beckett, for instance, that I didn't have in the book. But the experience itself was quite remarkable because I was able to meet Julian Bion for the first time, Bion's son. And when you meet him, he is absolutely the spitting image of his father, right down to the bow tie. And
Wow.
so he came and said a few words and left. And then we carried on and gave the papers on the twin and Bion's method of supervision. But it was a thrilling experience. I sent you a little video documentary we did with this wonderful, very renowned British sculptress, Billy Bond, in which she explained her process as an artist who knew nothing about Bion, just looking at his photographs and being most taken by his eyes and saying, those eyes have seen real horror, you know. And
Yes.
so she tried to depict that in her bust of Bion, but it was a thrilling experience to be there because when you visit the British Society, they have busts of the luminaries up on the wall. So you'll see Winnicott, you'll see Siegel, Klein, and then in short order, I think they're going to put Bion up there. But it was a wonderful experience.
Well, it's terrific. I again, I really enjoyed this paper, and I'm glad that you agreed to have this conversation with me and encourage everybody listening to this to download and read this paper. It's really a very significant contribution. So thank you very much,
Well,
Joe.
thank you, Neil. It's been
Nice
a
to
real
talk.
harmonic convergence to be able to chat with you about stuff that I know we're both very passionate about.
Indeed. Take care.